I was born and raised on the Pine Ridge Reservation, and I went to school, elementary and high school, at Holy Rosary Indian Mission, and moved to Rapid City during the war. My folks did, because all the jobs were up here. My dad went to work at what was called Rapid City Air Force Base at that particular time. But every school year, I would go back and spend my 9 months at Holy Rosary, and joined the military when I was 17. I served in Korea. And when I got out of the service, I used my GI Bill to go to school at University of Nevada, majored in business and journalism. And I was very fortunate. I decided to tack business on with my journalism background, because running a newspaper, I think I probably am now leaning more into the business end of it than in the newspaper side of it. And in 1990, I won a Nieman Fellowship to Harvard. And I was the first Native American print journalist to be admitted to the Nieman program at Harvard. So I spent 90 and 91 at Harvard. Started this newspaper 17 years ago, July the 1st. And started on the Pine Ridge Reservation, moved it to Rapid City when we needed it to have a larger facility to put in printing presses, and we've just continued to grow ever since. Have a bureau in Spokane, I have one in Albuquerque, and right now I probably have 125,000 readers every single week. Started out with just myself and my wife and a Maris brother named Brother Scotty, lived out in Oglala. And Brother Scotty helped do a little writing, and he did my photography, and he was also my salesman. And when we first started, I sold, I delivered, I took the paper to the printer, I laid the whole thing out. And my wife was the typesetter, the bookkeeper, and everything else. So the three of us got it going. And now we have probably 40 employees, full and part-time. And I have employees in the state of Washington, down in New Mexico, and my major facility is here in Rapid City, where we have our printing presses. And I'm really proud that people like Leon Warbonnet from the Pine Ridge Reservation has been with me for 16 years, and when it came time for him to learn the printing job, Ellen Newharth, who was the founder of USA Today, and who was from South Dakota, incidentally, called his printing plant in Chandler, Arizona, and said, there's some Indian boys coming down from Pine Ridge Reservation, and he said, I want you to put them to work, train them to be printers, and he let us do it at no cost to us. I was a reporter for the Rapid City Journal, and I was a regional editor for the Farmington Daily Times down in the Four Corners area of New Mexico. And one of the problems I ran into all the time was I wanted so much to do positive, constructive news stories about things that happen in Indian country, particularly when I worked for the Journal. I wanted very much to go out and do stories on my own reservation, Pine Ridge. And I was always discouraged from doing it, and the editor usually would say that because I'm Indian, I couldn't do an unbiased story. And my response to him always was, well, you have white reporters that are covering white issues, are they unbiased? But he couldn't see the difference. And at that particular time, we had just come out of very difficult times at Pine Ridge. We'd had Wounded Knee, the occupation there in 1973. We had the murder of the 2 FBI agents at Oglala in 1975. And I started doing a television show called The First Americans in 1976. It lasted for 2 years. But I knew that we had to have some kind of a newspaper on Pine Ridge. I mean, here we're 100 miles long, 50 miles wide, 20,000 people, no newspaper. And I just, to me, you can't make informed decisions if you don't have knowledge of what's happening in the world. And rumors, I think, probably created a lot of problems during the hectic days of the 70s at Pine Ridge, because there was no news vehicle that people could look at and get a clear picture of some of the things that were happening on the reservation. So I went back down to Pine Ridge. I moved back down there and went to the Stockman's Bank, along with 1946 Plymouth that Dickie Brewer, a friend of mine from Holy Rosary Mission, owned, that he had restored. And we put Dickie's car up for collateral, got a $4,000 loan, and started the paper on it. Started in an old beauty shop right in Pine Ridge Village. Matter of fact, our tables where we lay out our papers used to be the sinks where the women would put their heads back in to have their hair washed. We just covered it with plywood and used that a perfect spot to lay out our newspapers. I think probably one of the hardest things for any business, particularly I think Indian businesses, you need to have, you need to know your market. And starting a newspaper, you run into some obstacles that I think a business that's selling moccasins or beads or whatever doesn't run into, because you're dealing with issues. You're dealing with issues that are political. You're dealing with issues that might involve crime. And a lot of the things you're dealing with as the messenger that is delivering the message. But too often when the stories hit pretty close to home, you find people that want to kill the messenger. So my hardest thing was getting my paper into circulation, to try to get into the stores in Gordon, Nebraska and Rushville, because they had been accustomed to seeing what we used to call scandal sheets on the reservation. Somebody had raised enough money to print a newspaper that was just full of such libelous and slanderous things, and that would be maybe the only issue they'd ever put out, but they got their message out as slanted as it was. And the merchants that I was going to be dealing with, not only for advertising dollars, but also to sell my newspaper, were very reluctant to let us put our paper in there, because I was trying to sell a product that I didn't even have in my hand yet. I couldn't show them what it was going to be. I had to build a place to deliver it and some ads for it in order to have the money to get it printed. So it wasn't until our first issue came out that I could really go out and start pushing it and selling it, because I was very proud of that first issue. It dealt with a lot of good, positive things that were happening on the Pine Ridge Reservation. So after that, the merchants then start allow me to sell my papers there. And from the seat of my pants, I had to learn how to handle subscribers. What kind of a price am I going to set for an annual subscription? I don't know. I had to learn all these things from the seat of my pants. Started the paper in 1981, which if I had any business sense, I would never have done, because 1981 was the year during Jimmy Carter's administration when interest rates, I found out, were 21%. 1980 census had just come out, and Pine Ridge Reservation had been declared the poorest county in the United States, and I'm starting a business there. But I didn't know any better, and I didn't know that I couldn't succeed. I've always felt that if I'm going to push and really work hard at something, it's going to work. I'm going to make it work. And I guess that's the philosophy a lot of business people have to have if you're going to make it succeed. You can't take an attitude that I can't, because once you start saying I can't, you've already failed. Started out primarily to cover the Pine Ridge Reservation, because that's my home and that's the news that I felt like it handled the best. Pretty soon, people from Rosebud would be calling, and they'd want to know, when are you going to start bringing your paper over here? So we sort of expanded into Rosebud, which is our next move. And then we start hearing from people from Cheyenne River and Lower Brule and Crow Creek, and next thing you know, without planning, all of a sudden we're on all the reservations in South Dakota. And then we got into Montana, into Wyoming, into North Dakota, into the reservations in Nebraska. And it's been a slow process. We just didn't do it overnight. We just expanded as we felt we had the financial resources to make the next step. And finally, after 16 years behind us, we changed the name of the paper, I would say about 5 or 6 years ago, from Lakota Times to Indian Country Today. And we did it because we were becoming a national paper, and Lakota, of course, labeled us as Lakota. Then we were going to be circulating our paper among the Cherokee, Comanche, the Pueblos, and so we changed the name to Indian Country Today, because we wanted to reflect this is here and now. This is Indian Country, contemporary Indian Country today. We were still getting calls from other parts of the country. I had little knowledge of that there were 28 tribes just in the state of Washington, or what their culture was, what their traditions were. And after going up there and visiting with some of the tribal leaders and say, we need your paper up here, I sat down and had a long talk with the chairwoman of the Quinault tribe. Her name is Betty, or her name is or Pearl Beller. And Pearl wanted us up there so bad, she worked with me through my lawyer and purchased stock in our company. And it was that investment that allowed us to open a bureau in Spokane, Washington. Of course, the Southwest, you took it, New Mexico and Arizona, between those two states, there's probably 300,000 Indian people living. And they have their local papers. Each tribe has a small paper of its own, and the Navajo Times serves, of course, the Navajo Reservation. But we still felt that they needed a paper that would give them the capability of knowing what's going on in the rest of the country. And so we expanded into New Mexico. And one of the main reasons, I believe, is that we get ourselves into so much trouble as tribes because one tribe will get involved in a lawsuit, and that lawsuit will go all the way to the Supreme Court. And if that tribe loses that case, it affects all the tribes of the United States. I mean, we're talking about hunting rights, fishing rights, land rights, mineral rights. We've lost so many cases because the tribes didn't have knowledge that this case was going to go to the Supreme Court. And when that case went up there, they didn't have all of the tribes backing them up. Amicus briefs weren't filed to support them. And yet, if it involved the state of South Dakota or Wyoming, every Western governor had filed a brief to support their fellow governors. And so the tribes went in there almost bare. And when they lost a case, like the case in jurisdiction, in the state of Washington, it affected every tribe in the United States, even tribes that aren't under what they call Public Law 280, where states have jurisdictions. It affected every tribe, that Supreme Court case, because we didn't have enough togetherness to get behind that one tribe and support it. And I think that's what's really important about a newspaper. In order for us to support each other, like on this new issue coming up where they're talking about taxing Indian gaming, taxing Indian businesses, you're stepping on the feet of sovereign nations. I mean, if you're going to do that, you should tax all the state lotteries. You should tax the state businesses also, because they're also sovereign entities. So now that we have a national newspaper, we're getting support from all the tribes that have casinos right now that are submitting their logos, signatures signed by their tribal chairs, and we're doing 2 full pages outlining why the tribes consider this an illegal act. And every congressman and every senator in the state of, in Washington, D.C. is going to get a copy of that. So it's given us a single voice, really, we've never had before in Indian country. Each business, I think, has to look at what it does. Is it a service? Does it provide a service? Does it provide a product? A newspaper, I think, does probably a combination of all those things. We provide a service to our readers. We're supplying a product. We're also giving our readers an opportunity to find stores where they can shop, where there's bargains, because those stores that want to draw our particular clientele, my readership, to their places of business will place ads with us. And one of the things I've discovered is I have very loyal readers. If they see a business in Rapid City that places an ad for a product or a service, they'll frequent it because it's in their newspaper. This is their newspaper. And if that person wants to get their business and feels secure enough to put it in an Indian newspaper, they're going to shop there. So I think that's probably the hardest thing for us to overcome was ignorance. We're dealing with so many merchants that we want to solicit advertising dollars from, which is the backbone of my business. I can't pay salaries, I can't pay my overhead because we're not a federal entity. We have no federal dollars coming to us. All of my income is through advertising and selling subscriptions to the paper. 80% of my income is from advertising sales. But I ran into, and my salespeople today run into, such ignorance that we are not only trying to solicit an ad from a business, we're also trying to educate that owner of the business that if you take a look at South Dakota, west of the Missouri River to the Wyoming line, we make up 20% of the total population. I mean, that's like a small city. And yet we run into customers like a guy that owned a big carpet store in Rapid City, and he said, to my salesman, Indians don't use carpets. I mean, where do we start, you know? I mean, it's like he thinks we're still living in teepees. Well, I started a newspaper that was going to be totally independent. I didn't want any tribal involvement because I felt I couldn't have the editorial freedom. And so I couldn't turn to federal agencies, whether it be the Small Business Bureau or whatever, do not finance newspapers. And for very definite reasons, because you know they might finance a newspaper that could turn out to be a very left wing or very right wing. So Small Business Administration will not make loans to newspapers. Banks are very reluctant to deal with newspapers because our product is pretty intangible. Until you're established and you have a building with land and a $250,000 printing press, you don't have any assets. Most of your assets are up here in your head. You know, you're putting your thoughts down, your ideas, you're doing news stories and pictures. Those are your assets, but they're intangibles. They're very hard to sell. So you have to, like we did. I raised the money by having a friend that had an antique car. And after that, we scrambled from week to week to week to get in the advertising dollars, to sell enough papers over the counter at stores. I remember our second year in business, it was a week before Christmas. I had 5 employees then. No money for the payroll. I could not make the Christmas payroll. And so I went across the border to Rushville, Nebraska, and a guy named Mr. Hunter sat down in his bank, literally with my hat in my hand, and said, "It's Christmas." Said as pathetically as I could, "Please, my employees need to be paid. They have children." And he very kindly gave me a loan enough to make the next 2 paydays. And luckily we had a lot of advertising dollars came in that not only allowed me to make payrolls from then on, but also to repay that loan. So it's really hard starting a business and raising the money. When you're on your own out there, the hardest thing you have is to meet your payrolls every single week, knowing that you've got families that are dependent on your business. And now with 35 and 40 employees, I've got a huge payroll. And I need to make sure that we've got sold enough newspapers, we've sold enough advertising every single week, so that when payroll comes time, no one has to worry. They got their checks. And that's one of the hard responsibilities of being a business owner. A newspaper, I think, is one of the few products in a business where you can sit down at the end of the week and actually hold in your hand all the work you've done that week. It's all there. You've got the stories that have been written, you've got all the pictures that have been taken, you've got ads of all the kids that are graduating from Pine Ridge High School or Tulalip High School. You've got sports stories, everything that your whole crew has labored on, and everyone that works in this paper contributes to that. At the end of the week, we're going to be able to sit down and look at what we did. And that's probably one of the most rewarding things is when those presses are running back there, you can walk back there and pick up the paper, ink still on it, and read and look at the work that all your employees have labored to put out that week. The fact that we have a voice that is not only local now, but is national and even international, because we have subscribers in 17 foreign countries, as well as all 50 states. And you're getting letters from all over the world, people that have read articles and are responding to them, whether positively or negatively. The fact that we can affect a state election, whereas I think probably maybe the first time in the history of this state when someone's running for Congress or the Senate, South Dakota, they come to Indian country today. They want to talk to all my employees. They want our paper to endorse them because they know that the Indian vote can get them in office or can keep them out of office. A good example of that is Tim Johnson. He won with 3% of the vote to become the United States Senator, and he took every reservation in the state. So the Indian vote put Tim Johnson in the Senate. Tom Daschle, when he ran, that happened to him too. It was the Indian vote. So it feels good to have a newspaper where the politicians are coming and wanting to talk to you, to put in their stories because they're looking for that Indian vote. In 1989, when we were coming up to the 100th anniversary of Wounded Knee, I did an editorial in which I suggested that we use 1990 as a year of healing, a year of reconciliation. And Governor at that time was George Mickelson. He thought it was a darn good idea. He wrote an editorial for our paper, and he takes up that challenge. He would proclaim 1990 a year of reconciliation, and it was off of that column that he did. In South Dakota, when Columbus Day comes around, we don't celebrate it. South Dakota is the only state of all 50 that celebrates Native American Day. And it happened because this newspaper fought it all the way to the state legislature and got the bill passed. So there's things a newspaper can do that you can see happening that are changing, the face of South Dakota. South Dakota at one time was called the Mississippi of the North, back in the 70s. And I've seen a lot of changes, in the past that I never thought I would ever see before. We see people like Lionel Bordeaux and myself, two Indians, one from Rosebud and one from Pioneers, gets in the South Dakota Hall of Fame. I mean, who would ever thought that would ever happen? When I was a kid at Holy Rosary Mission, somebody would have told me that someday you're going to be in South Dakota Hall of Fame. I'd have probably laughed in their face. In fact, 5 years ago I would have. So there's things that this paper can do that I don't think any other business can really do.